Hi, this is Craig Dunn. I'm the Wilder Distinguished Professor of Business and Sustainability here at Western Washington University and immediate past Dean of the College of Business and Economics. And I want to welcome you to this talk with Doug Schuler, who's a faculty member at Rice University in Houston. So I want to welcome you, Doug, to this conversation about some of the work that you're doing at Rice University.
Thank you. Thanks, Craig. I'm glad to be here.
And we're glad you're here. The first thing I'd like to do is explore a little bit of your educational background. I know that you went to UC Berkeley and then University of Minnesota. Can you tell us a little bit about what you studied and why you selected the areas to study that you did?
Yeah, I mean, I was an undergraduate at UC Berkeley many years ago, and I love.
We don't need to know how many.
Yeah. No, I love politics, and I was always interested in public policy, studied political science, and then my father told me it was hard to get a job. Perhaps he's right. So anyway, I ended up in the business school, a bit miserable, didn't really like the courses. But during the summer, I had worked for California State Lands Commission about antitrust law. And I was really interested in kind of the role of businesses and kind of using regulations to make money, really to, I think, violate the public good. And then my very last semester at UC Berkeley, I took a course called kind of Business Government Society. And I thought, that's what I want to do. I didn't even know it existed.
Right.
By then, I had kind of committed to leaving school, but I learned about the field, and I took a job in San Francisco, worked in public accounting.
So who taught that Business Government Society class?
That was Bud Chait, one of the big grandfathers of the field.
And you took a job then in San Francisco doing?
Accounting.
Wow.
Pretty miserable.
Yeah.
Wanted to be a bike racer.
Yeah, but you were an accountant.
Yes.
But not for long, right?
Not for very long.
Yeah.
So ended up finding a program at University of Minnesota called Business Government and Society in the business school. Went there, studied with Stephanie Lenway, public policy, super interesting, and always had an interest in social responsibility and public policy and the public interest, and went from there.
Do those Business Government Society programs still exist?
Barely.
Barely?
Barely.
Do they call them that anymore?
At some schools they've been overtaken by the economists.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I don't hear so much about Business Government Society anymore, but we do talk about corporate social responsibility or corporate social performance or social contract theory, stakeholder management.
No, I think some of those people sit in strategy departments, management departments, probably sustainability, sustainability, and so some of that stuff's there. Yeah, we probably don't get too much business government anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, and yet we have here at Western this combined major in business and sustainability at the undergraduate level that is our full foundation and core in business, and quite a bit of environmental policy and some environmental science as well. So it's environmental studies, environmental science. So I guess in a way we've constructed a major that covers some of those topics, but generally concentrated on sustainability or environmental issues, which is why we ask you here, actually. Because I became very interested in a project that I'd like to get to that you've worked on, that really, there was a personal connection between you and your father-in-law, from what I understand, that really began with a solar cooking project. And I remember when I was a kid, I got really interested in these parabolic mirrors, and at the time you would basically take a hot dog, right, on a skewer, and you would put it at the focal point, and you cook half of it because that's the part where the focal point would. But this isn't exactly what you were doing. Why don't you describe what you were doing, which was a machine that was the size of a couple picnic tables. It was 2 meters by 2 meters, something like that.
Yeah, so I've been teaching a course at Rice called Social Enterprise, and it really looks at the role of business in addressing social issues. There's a certain irony there, right? Because many of us in the academy and outside of the academy thinks business causes a lot of bad things to happen in society.
Right.
But this course was looking at ways of using essentially private enterprise, incentives, et cetera, to get businesses into some of these social areas. And that could be any kind of social areas, right? It could be homelessness, it could be abuse, it could be poverty, it could be social justice. And my father-in-law, Jean Boubor, is an inventor, and he had this solar cooker, and it was intended for rural areas of developing countries, yet it was sitting in his backyard in France, which was not a rural area of a developing country.
And a climate not dissimilar from that we find in Bellingham.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So really, we were just talking a little bit like Professor Dunn and myself right here, but we were in a garden, we were drinking beer, and we thought, I wonder if we could create an enterprise around this technology to disseminate it. And so, of course, I'm a university professor, I'm a teacher, that's my profession. I'm not really an entrepreneur.
And you're not a scientist.
And I'm not a scientist.
You're more a scientist today than you were then.
I am.
Yeah.
So we wrote a grant, and we got funded, and then it was like, what are we going to do with this cooker? So Rice is a...
So who funded you?
We got funded by a foundation, by something that Shell had funded Rice. So it was called the Shell Center for Sustainability. It was an internal grant within Rice. But yeah, either Shell Foundation or Shell Oil Company had paid for that grant. So a bit ironic, right?
Yes.
But so we ended up going to Haiti because Rice has we have a program called Rice 360 Global Health Institute. We have field projects, and we had a site there, and there was an elementary school, and we took our cooker to the elementary school because they need to cook meals for kids. So we thought, what a great place.
So how does that cooker work, or did it work?
Yeah, so it's called a parabolic trough solar concentrator. It essentially reflects light to a focal point. And at that focal point we have a fluid. Our fluid happens to be water. The water turns to steam, about 140 to 160 Celsius.
So it's a low temperature steam.
It's called low temperature steam, and we use that steam for cooking. You could use it for many, many things, but we use it for cooking. So you inject it into pots, you boil water, you can put the steam directly like a rice cooker, and we can cook. So it's very efficient. We can cook about 40 kilograms of rice or beans a day, which is essentially what the school lunch was.
Really? For how many students?
They had 400 kids.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it would actually be that productive, that efficient.
Yeah, no. It's technically it's good.
So what's the problem with it?
It's not good for. What's the problem?
Yeah.
The cooks hated it.
Oh.
Yeah. Cooks hated it.
Why?
Why not? It had everything going wrong for it from their perspective, and that was our big lesson we learned in Haiti.
Well, they didn't need it, right? I mean, they had alternative sources of energy that they were accustomed to.
The cooks did. The boss didn't. The boss was paying for the fuel, and so they were so they were cooking on commercial kitchen, like you'd find here on campus or in a restaurant.
But there was an economic value proposition, one might think, because you could eliminate the cost of the fuel.
Absolutely.
But that wasn't enough to overcome the barriers from the cooks.
That's right. That's right, because they cooked indoors. This was outdoors. They cooked in a community, in the kitchen. All the women went to work. They chatted with each other, gossiped, exchanged stories, all the things you do in a workplace.
Right.
And when you're doing solar cooking, you're out there on your own. So it's almost like you draw straws, and if you get the wrong one, you're doing solar cooking. So you can imagine how happy the cooks were, or the cook was.
Not
at
at
all. To go
all.
out there. Not happy at all.
Right.
And it's a bizarre device, right? It wasn't familiar. It was, you had to use tools to access that version of it. And so it was really kind of a failure. Although we demonstrated well, the staff came out, we cooked for staff, the teachers, they loved it, thought it was cool. Wow, we can eat off this solar device.
Yeah.
But your main users, right, in a kitchen, the superstar is the chef.
Right.
And we totally forgot about the superstar.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That really is interesting. It's also about, I think, about some of the principles of diffusion of innovation. There's a balance to be struck between doing something that's really innovative, but if you go too far in that direction, then you have the loss of familiarity. So I think of it, for example, of the Tesla S when it was first introduced, had what looked to be a grill. And it's like, why does it have a grill? It doesn't have an engine, a radiator. And it was a fake grill, but it was made that way to make the car look more like what people expected a car to look like. Interestingly, as that technology has evolved, in the last iteration, the refresh, they call it, of the Tesla, they eliminated that design element, and now it's just a flat facade, which is what they're putting in the Tesla 3. Or you think about also...
A lot of people think it looks ugly.
The new one?
Yeah.
Yeah, I happen to like it, but then I'm also an early adopter of new technology. You also think about how charging stations look and function. And they have a hose and a nozzle, and they have a little door that looks like a door that would cover up a gas cap. And so all of that is familiar to a consumer, whereas you could have something that was a very different mechanism for charging those cars. But if you're too innovative, then people go, well, what do I do with this thing, whatever it is? It could be an induction charger for a car, for example. So it sounds like you were a little too innovative in terms of being something radically different from what the cooks were used to.
Yeah, I mean, for me it was embarrassing because, as Dr. Dunn has already said, and as I said in the introduction, my background's not in engineering, so I always felt kind of illegitimate on the project for many years. Sometimes I still do. Now we're 8 years into it, as we'll get to very shortly. And so the only place I felt I had legitimacy were on the human factors of this.
And those are where you failed.
And that's where we failed.
Yeah.
So I thought, oh my goodness, what a great partner we have brought onto this project. But
what a great learning.
Yeah, it was, and again, it got us into considering much more the interface between the user and the device, which is part of our next iteration that we'll talk about shortly. And then it got us really thinking about the system in which I think is much more interesting, the system in which that device is kind of inserted.
So you considered that kind of a failed experiment. The cooks didn't want to adopt it. You drugged this thing halfway around the world. That couldn't have been easy either.
No. And
then what happened to it?
So we, when we were really at the American Airlines ticket counter in Port-au-Prince Airport, we pretty much had our tails between our legs, and we knew we got to get out of here. This cooking experiment in Haiti was not the way to go, and it was kind of confirmed as we reflected when we got back home and we talked about the project, and we began to talk to others who, I would give a little PowerPoint about what we did, and it was pretty clear that cooking was a bad application, and we began to think about what were the characteristics of cooks. But besides being in a kitchen and being indoors and working with familiar things. And we thought one of the challenges of cooking, and this was really told us by one of the people we dealt with after the trip, was cooks typically take their cue backwards. So a lot of people...
What does that mean?
A lot of people like to cook the way their mother cooked.
Oh.
They like to cook the way grandmother cooked. And grandmother, it was not grandmother's cooking next week, it's grandmother's old cooking. So we thought, boy, here we are with this technology. It looks kind of weird. It's a new way of cooking. We need to be around some users who might be a little bit more comfortable with something new. Perhaps like...
And that wouldn't be cooks.
Probably wouldn't be cooks. Could be people like in the studio here running these cameras. But as you know, and we'll talk about next, we thought it could be people who work in a hospital setting with equipment where they're taking cues from science and discovery, etc. Maybe that could be a good set of users for us.
Was there a problem you were trying to solve with that solar cooker? I mean, was it just elimination of the fuel, or? Yeah, I mean, or was it something more than that? Was it?
No, I think our conception of the problem in Haiti was that they had an energy problem.
Okay.
Yeah. So we were solving an energy problem. So kids were getting Kids were getting food.
Right.
But it was really the cost. It was it was how that food was prepared, and essentially not the method, not the recipes, right? The fuel used to power how they got that, and that was the problem we thought we were solving in Haiti.
Right, right. If you had taken that same application and moved it into the backcountry where perhaps kids weren't getting fed because the infrastructure wasn't there to deliver traditional fuel to a traditional kitchen, would that have made a difference, do you think? Or you still have the cook problem?
No, it may have. So, for example, right now, as you might imagine, that capture, the device is called Capture Soleil, capture the sun. That device was essentially mothballed, but it got resurrected. And right now it's sitting on a farm, not very far.
In France?
No, in Haiti.
Oh, it's still in Haiti. Oh, you left it behind.
Oh, yeah, sitting in
You didn't
Haiti.
want to see it again.
We had others.
Oh, you had others.
Yeah. No, so it's so it got moved to a farm, a Jatropha plantation. Jatropha is used as a small plant. It has a little pod, and you can squeeze it, and it has an oil, and you can use that oil to make biodiesel. It's done in India, and an NGO went in and thought here was an area that they could get some income for these people. Fuel's, very expensive in Haiti. There's a lot of poverty in Haiti, especially in a rural part where you'd have a Jatropha plantation. So they went in and helped. I don't know if they planted a new orchard or if they repurposed kind of an older orchard. And so again, one of the things that happens in Haiti, at least we were told, I haven't been to this area, that particular place, is that part of the employment contract, besides a wage the worker gets, is a hot midday meal.
Oh, interesting.
And they were using charcoal. That's the fuel of choice for most Haitian cooking.
And they were cooking inside? Or
No, outside.
Oh, good.
Yeah, outside. And it was a single cook, right? Because she was out on this in this agricultural thing.
So there wasn't that social connection
Absolutely.
that you had the problem with.
So they attempted to resurrect the capture for cooking, unsuccessfully because of some technical problems now with the capture. Apparently it needs a repair. But they came up with another interpretation of it. They ended up, so squeezing Jatropha plants, which I've never done, apparently is a little bit like operating a big garlic press.
Oh.
And so you're squeezing this material through this small grate. And as many of you have probably experienced, if you've used a garlic press,
They get clogged?
They get clogged.
Yep.
But they get less clogged if you heat your garlic.
Oh, I see.
But beforehand. But if you heat your garlic, you need power. And they were creating something to make power.
Right.
So they started putting Jatropha seeds in a big long tube, PVC plastic that they probably had laying around, painted it black, and they suspended it. And they
At
were
the focal point of the
close enough.
trough.
They created a new focal point. It was good enough, right?
Yeah.
And they've been doing that. So it was actually a very interesting user reinterpretation of
So
technology.
it wasn't creating steam at that point?
No, forget steam.
Forget steam, yeah.
Yeah, just use the sunlight at the focal point.
Yeah.
And again, anyone who goes sunbathing knows you can do that, right?
Yeah.
You can have some little bit of your skin have a lot of heat. And so that's what they've been doing.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So you kind of decided to do what entrepreneurs call a pivot, and you looked for
Politicians too, apparently. Not very well.
And so you ended up doing a pivot and deciding that you needed to look at a market that would be more amenable to innovation.
Absolutely.
And so then what happened?
Well, I probably did something similar to what I'm going to do here at Western. I gave a public talk to an audience, and we had already considered other applications, but we had somebody in that audience come to us afterwards and basically verify, kind of validate one of the applications, and it was It was to use that steam to sterilize medical instruments. We didn't know very much about medical instrument sterilization, but we began to look into it at that point. So we did.
Yeah.
So what we found out is when you go off grid. So maybe before we go there, at a medical facility, at a modern hospital, like we'd have here in Bellingham, when you have surgery, some of those instruments get reused. They don't throw away everything. And the challenge in a medical setting with an instrument is the instrument can become basically a transportation vehicle
for bad stuff.
Yeah. And so you want to stop that, and you do it through a process called sterile processing. You basically wash it and sterilize it, and steam is the kind of number one choice of sterilization. There's some small exceptions to that for certain kinds of instrumentation, but for the vast majority of instrumentation, we do steam sterilization.
Is that what an autoclave is?
That is an autoclave.
And does an autoclave use steam?
It does use steam.
Okay, so basically you put medical instruments inside this, looks like a pressure cooker kind of thing?
Yeah, it's some kind of chamber.
Some kind of chamber, and then you pump steam in and it sterilizes the instruments.
Yeah, you actually create steam within the chamber.
Okay.
Usually you put an energy source to the autoclave.
To the chamber itself.
Yeah, and there's already some water in there, and it turns into steam. So basically, the shortest answer is we were able to convert this solar steam machine that we had into an energy source to run very small autoclaves. We had a lot of success with that. I started working with engineering students at Rice. They were fabulous. We learned a lot about interface in Haiti. We made a much easier user interface. So even though we thought we had more sophisticated users, even sophisticated users may not want to work really hard to get something in and off, especially if it's hot, right? Steam is hot. And we made it much easier to use, and we validated it. We ran experiments. We had really good results, kind of R squared 1.0, like that's good in our craft.
You're talking to a philosopher. I don't know what that means. No idea.
Published a paper in a peer-reviewed.
But in terms of the UI, the user interface, it wasn't as radically different as it was with a cooking device, right? Because the autoclave looked like an autoclave. It was still steam sterilization. I mean, did they have to go outside to do this versus
they
inside?
did. So the autoclave was the same.
Yes.
So we ended up going to Sierra Leone in 2013 to a district hospital, and the autoclave part was the same. So that was a big advantage.
Right.
The users knew what to do. They know what autoclaving is.
Yeah.
It still has some challenges, right? Because, again, they used to autoclave indoors.
Yes.
This was outdoors. So you had to think about the instrument flow within the health facility, right? From the OR to the sterile processing to inventory back to the OR. And we were inserting this new thing where some of that flow would have to go outside, which it wasn't necessarily a deal breaker, but it certainly doesn't make it easier, right? It's not seamless.
But what I saw was an intermodal container that had been repurposed, that's a shipping container,
Yes.
with solar panels on the roof. And that doesn't sound like what you're describing.
No. So we got back from Sierra, so we had one more pivot, as you say. So when we got back, we thought Sierra Leone, we weren't tail between the legs, but it was like we just knew it wasn't quite right. And by then I'd been working in sterile processing for a number of years, and I knew there were a number of steps in sterile processing, and we were only doing one, running the autoclave, because we thought that was the weak link.
Right.
But it turns out it wasn't necessarily the weak link. The weak link might have been everything else. Good washing, good inventory control, quality control. So I got back to Houston in 2013, and by now I kind of know the community of people at the big medical hospitals in Houston. And I said, can we take what you do in this big facility, and could we do it in a very small space? And the only small space I could think of, a little bit inspired by Sierra Leone and small businesses, were shipping containers, because they're ubiquitous. They're all over the world.
Right. Oftentimes abandoned.
Yeah, because there's basically more come from Asia than go to Asia.
That's right. Yeah.
So they end up in places like Houston, Bellingham, and Freetown and Kono and Sierra Leone. So we started taking shipping containers, and we have basically created an entire integrated sterile processing unit. And it is autonomous in terms of water. So we have kind of a low-tech water filtration, because you need water.
So the parabolic trough is a thing of the past.
It is gone.
And now photovoltaics, solar panels, have taken the place of that?
We have solar PV, very small installation, about 1 kilowatt on the 4 panels on the roof. And we're running an electric hot plate. And that electric hot plate heats these kind of non-electric autoclaves. So the same autoclave we were using before, the same autoclave that's very ubiquitous in the field.
And familiar to the user.
Familiar to the user, that we can do. Now, we considered using gas. That's what's used. When they do this in the field, they use gas. And our container could do that. There were some reasons, I think, being on campus, with students.
Because a demonstration project is at Rice.
Yeah.
But the gas, then, obviously you'd have to refuel that device, whereas with the photovoltaics, the solar panels, then you don't have to.
That's right. You have to be on supply chain. You have to get gas, and all those type of things.
Yeah. So is it a success now?
Well,
it's a demonstration project, right?
Yeah.
Have you taken it to the backcountry?
Yeah, so the pilot's been really successful. So again, we validated, we want to make sure that that this container was efficacious technically. And we pretty much proved that. We ran experiments, we had very good results, basically matched hospital on results, both on decontamination, sterilization, published a paper in PLOS One this year. Got a lot of feedback and publicity for that. So right now we're just carefully kind of evaluating. I was in Haiti I was in Malawi in June, going to hospitals, talking to users, and mostly staff. And both the operating staff and the people in physical assets management who actually repair equipment. I see. They're a very important stakeholder in a hospital, because they keep things moving.
Yeah, so what you learned from what happened in Haiti is what you're addressing now, right? You're actually looking at the users and looking at all the social architecture that surrounds this device.
I think so.
Looking for barriers to implementation.
That's right, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. I mean, I think this is an awesome story, because it shows how that you've been able to take one application, really transform it to another. It doesn't even look anything similar to what it looked like before. No. But it's still using a more direct application of the power of the sun to solve a social problem. It's just that there have been these numbers of pivots along the way. And this is designed really for use in an off-grid application. Is that right or no?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's another difference, that it has a different value proposition. It's not just replacing or eliminating a fuel source that you have to pay for on a monthly basis, but it's actually designed to go somewhere where you wouldn't have access to a traditional fuel source. Is that right?
It is, and unfortunately, we live in a world of great energy kind of injustice, right? There's many places that don't have very good access to fuel. If they do, it tends to be the elites. Oftentimes institutions like a hospital would have access, but it would be, again, very limited, only used for certain purposes. And it really affects the quality of healthcare that a lot of people get. So, ours is a little piece, right? Obviously, anyone familiar with a hospital knows that's a complex system itself, has many different parts. We're really a support system for the OR, but I think this concept can be expanded, and that's something we're trying to do right now with some partners.
Well, that'll be the next chapter. Yeah. I want to thank you for your time. This has been really fascinating. I think you've given both our faculty, our staff too, and our students a lot to think about. So thanks for being here.
Great. Thank you.
Appreciate it.